E a moa ke ana te tiro ki runga o te rangi, ki te nui o te rangi, ki te tapu o te rangi, ki te hāhā o te rangi. E whakakorowaitia rā tātou ki te korowai o te manaki, e whakakorowaitia tātou ki te korowai o te aroha, o te atawhai, o te tehi ki te tehi. A moa ke ana ki ngā kaupapa o te wā, he whenei nei i te āhuatanga o te taratahi nā tata nei, o tirā ki te oranga tonutanga o te tangata a mohoa nei, a haere ake nei. No reira e te iwi, nau mai, haere mai ki tēnei kaupapa. Tēnei whakāturanga o te rauora, e whakahui nei i ngā kaupapa kōrero o te motu, kia pai ai te pānui haere, i ngā tū āhuatanga, i tae mai kia tātou i te wā o te rāhui, i te wā o te taratahi. No reira e te iwi, tēnei te mihi, tēnei te mihi, tēnei te mihi. Whānau, it's absolutely fantastic to invite you to listen to the kōrero today. And Te Rauora has been conscientious in gathering all of the kōrero from across the motu and the responses to the rāhui o the taratahi during the COVID-19 lockdowns, and how our whānau, how our hapu, our iwi, our community organisations and those that are out there on the ground and how they coped with this. And today we have the absolute honour of having our pou kōrero oroto o te Waiponamu, te Mare Kura, Dr. Justine Kemp, and te tuakana, Peter Allison, here to give us a snapshot into some of the things that they've been up to and some of the experiences that they have found useful throughout the lockdown. So, kaore I koe atu, e mihi ana kia koe e te tuahine, e mihi ana kia koe e te tuakana. Aotirā, kōrua ngā ika nui o te kōrero o tēnei rā, tēnei te mihi ake, tēnā kōrua. I'm going to pass straight over to you in the presentation, Justine and Peter, tēnā kōrua.
Ora.
Kia ora koutou, tēnei te mihi kia koutou. Ko tēnei te ruru te kaukau mai nei, ki hae mahititi, ki hae marakaraka, tūpoko nui o te ruru te rakau, he pō he ao kāwatea, te hei maari ora. Tēnei te mihi kia koe I rāhui, ka nei te mihi mō tō whakatūwhera taki I tēnei ata. He uri ahau o tahu potiki, no o tāpau me pokataraki, e mai ana ki te hawara mato ki te tonga. So Peter Allison, I guess whakapapa here to Pokataraki no Tāka, who we're going to be talking about, but also have connections up north as well into Taranaki and Ngāti as well as down south in Rakiura. So kanut mihi kia koutou. Kia ora.
Tēnā tātou, he mihi hoki tēnei kia koutou e whakaroko mai nei kia maua tahi. He uri hoki ahau no Auraki Mauka, nā hana ko Waitakitaki te awa riri atu ki tēnei tai, ko ara te uru tēnā, ko kaitahu kātima moe rapu ai Waitaha ka iwi, ko ka te huirapa ki Puketeraki, ka te moki tuarua, ka te rua hiki ka hapu, ko Justine tōku kikwa. Kia ora, I'm also from Ōtākau, Puke, Wairaki, and a few other people within this lovely whenua down here in Te Waiponamu. So we're just going to launch on with our kōrero today. We've used this whakatauki to sort of describe what we think our COVID response was here in the south. So as you know, we're quite famous for our pounamu, and to work that pounamu, we use the sandstone, and so it's that iterative chipping away at things to get the desired result that you want, which I think hopefully encapsulates what our communities did. So I think the three themes, if we were going to get a little bit nerdy and analyse the kōrero that we had with our whānau, they were manaaki, a manaaki for each other, our mana motahaki, taking control of our own situation, and a really strong desire to ensure that our whānau hapu and our community that sat around us, so our bubbles, didn't relive the devastation that we lived in 1835 during a measles epidemic. So our tipuna Tūhowaiki, who signed the treaty down here in the south, talked about the impact of the measles epidemic in 1835 which actually went from Christchurch south, but at Ōtākau, which is where we're beginning our journey, we had quite a thriving community down there. They said somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people were living there, and after the epidemic there were around 200 people that survived. That was devastating. That is in our whakapapa, it is in our collective memory, and it underpinned Ōtākau and Puketaraki's response to COVID-19. I'll just give you a minute to read the so we were once a numerous people, our parents, uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters, children lie around us. We were but a poor remnant. We are dotted in families few and far between, where formerly we lived as tribes. We had a worse enemy than Te Rauparaha, and that was the visit of the Pākehā with his drink and disease. We think us very corrupted, but the very scum of Port Jackson shipped us as whalers and landed as sealers on this coast. They brought us new plagues unknown to our fathers till our people melted away. I've already talked about that, so I'll just keep going. Obviously, the lasting impact has been the land loss in whangaitahu. That was incredibly significant. We had a fair amount of the island. So at Ōtākau, I've got a picture coming up. It is the name of the channel that runs from Harwood Point at the mouth of the harbour. We call it the Kayak. Most people in Ngaitahu know it as the Kayak. And so the harbour itself, that particular part of the channel, is called, recently we found in HK Title's diaries that it's Te Awa Ōtākau, or Te Awa Moana, so I'm not sure whether he was referring to fresh or salted water or not. It is one of the 3 places in the south where the treaty was signed in 1840. Michelle Taido is the manager of Ōtākau, and the first question we put to her was what drove her response and actions for the small community. And as you can see here, she thought about the flu and the measles epidemic and what the devastation that it can have on a small community. In her head, she felt there was no other choice. They created a private Facebook page, so that was just for the residents as opposed to the wider membership. There was already a Facebook page for that. So her focus was, because we were in bubbles obviously and we couldn't, so they weren't allowed to go to town and we couldn't go in. And so the focus was the people that lived in the community. They started a phone tree, so basically members of the Rūnaka were able to ring around and make sure that people were contacted, that nobody was isolated and that everybody was checked in on. There was a conversation with the local police about did we want roadblocks into the community, but as Michelle said, once the Albatross colony, which is a major tourist destination, and the cruise ships were banned from coming to New Zealand, there was no need to put up physical roadblocks, and so her decision was to lock the community in. So basically no one was allowed to go, so all the shopping, all needs were met by the Rūnaka members in their whānau. So here is a small snapshot of some of the gorgeous goodies that whānau received. So food was a major part, cooking and making sure that everybody had nutritious meals, had access to kai moana, and one of our fabulous bakers, Jules Asher, also did some baking which got sent out. Actually, it did go wider than the community. So there was a partway point between Ōtākau and town where people would meet on the Kayak Road and basically share things. In the bottom left-hand corner were the hygiene packs, so Pūtahitanga, which is the Southern Whānau Water Commissioning Agency, organised hygiene packs, and they were distributed amongst whānau via Te Kaika, I think. There's a picture of Ōtākau, which I probably should have said before. So there was a lot more than that went on. So each of the Rūnaka had to work with the Dunedin City Council as part of the emergency response system. They had to ship in tanks of water. So it's a rural community. There isn't a town supply of water, and I can't remember why because I don't have my book with me, but the water supply was cut off, and so the Rūnaka had to tank in water to make sure everybody had clean water and other things. The last part of the conversation that we had with her, and I feel like I'm not doing what they did justice, but was to look at recovery. So as you could imagine, like many other communities across the nation, people lost their jobs during this time, and so Ōtākau have been looking at ways that they can support whānau members to keep jobs or find new jobs. So there's currently a rabbit infestation down at Ōtākau, and so they're trying to see if they can find funding to have a full-time ranger who can get rid of the rabbits. There was again the threat of a community outbreak, but we're certainly feeling really privileged and lucky down here that so far it hasn't hit the community, and that is in the back of their mind, learning from what happened the first time and what can happen better to move on. Puketaraki is another settlement. It's about 35 minutes north of Dunedin, and you can look directly from Puke over to Ōtākau on a nice day, of course. So when I asked the rūnaka what this focus was, and I stayed with Mum at that point, so got to witness firsthand what the rūnaka were doing. Again, similar to Ōtākau, it was around contactless support. So there was a Facebook page, they did telephone trees, regular pānui, and a lot of what both rūnaka had to do was take what was quite complicated information from the government, from Te Rōpū, Whakaurutā, and Facebook, and sort of try and put it into a translatable, easily understandable format so that people understood what was happening and why it was happening. Again, Puke also got hygiene packs. Aroha Allison, who's an absolute fabulous cook, made meals twice a week. Puketaraki has a rūnaka garden, so whānau were also given fresh vegetables throughout the lockdown. Again, it was all about manaaki, it was all about communication. The rūnaka set up a pūtea tautoko, and Peter sits on the executive. I think it's still going. So people can apply for some support, some financial support if they need it still. The meals only stopped maybe about 2 months ago, and I think one of the last meals was a really nice feeder tuna, which I've just said. So one of the sort of things that stood out for me when I was interviewing Aroha about what it was like to drive around the community and drop off meals was that for some of our whānau, especially our kaumātua, she was the only person that they saw during that time. And she certainly felt quite bad when she knew she had to leave them to carry on and do what she was doing. So I did the interviews in July, and so Suzanne said, we're here in July, the country is reopened, we've put some extra layers of cleaning at the marae, so I'm sure like most marae around the country, both Ōtākau and Puke shut. And when we went to level 2 last time, we shut again. So we're only open for business at level 1. So they continue to deliver food to the kaumātua, and the gardeners are replanting and replenishing our mārua, and one of those, my mama Kyla, is one of those and enjoying the replanting, I'm sure. She's online. Hi.
So kia ora anō. So just to talk about the health response really and where we got to. And I guess it was a fairly simple process. We needed to get more Māori tested. That was our main goal, I think. So we used the MOH COVID response plan, grabbed hold of that, looked at all the information coming out of our Māori health experts, our professionals, our doctors, clinicians, tōku whakakaupapa urutā, and we set up, our processes to get people tested. We already had community-based assessment centres, CBAC, set up. We had general practices and dedicated practices as well, including our 2 Māori practices down south, the Puna Wilder and Invercargill, and Te Kaika here in Dunedin, set up to test. But when talking to whānau's iwi te hapu, they were concerned about coming out of their bubbles to access some of those things. So I guess our response was about taking services out to the community, to our marae, where people could access those, remain in their bubbles, come through a drive-through type process, and be tested and receive a flu vaccination as well. And I guess thinking back to March, April, we were sort of this is where things kicked off. You know, we had all that clusters. There's the Bluff wedding, there's the Hereford conference in Queenstown, and this is where things really started to fly with the COVID sort of numbers. So our approach was about making things accessible and available to Māori, about increasing the rates of testing and also flu vaccinations, recognising we didn't want people getting sick from influenza and things as well, and have that sort of that double whammy type thing. So we organised to have 4 marae-based testing and flu vax clinics out at Karatani, we just talked about, at Ōtākau as well, and also 2 down south, one Awaroa Runaka down in Bluff, and one in Waihopai down in Invercargill as well. And I think late April, early May, so it's a while ago now, and it seems a bit of a lifetime ago, to be honest. But we went to Puketaraki out on a beautiful day, and I think it was late April. Sun was shining, and it was our first experience of taking our testing on the road and out into the community. So I guess just a couple of pictures there. One is of the drive-through. It was a drive-through clinic, beautiful day, and a lot of whānau, and not just Māori came through as well, a lot of non-Māori came through these centres as well, from the communities. Received testing, received flu vax, and it was a great day at Puke, really great for our staff as well from well south, from the DHB to get out in the community, come out of those CBACs. They've been based inside dreary old factories basically for weeks doing testing, and it was great for them to get out in the community as well, and they really enjoyed that experience. Second one we did was down at Te Rawaroa, down in Awaroa, down in Bluff. And as I said, that was a focus. It was a big cluster there, that Bluff cluster, which I think was one of the larger clusters in our community. So great to get down there. The weather wasn't as great as it was in Puke, so we couldn't do a drive-through. We had to bring whānau in the back door of the marae, down around the corridor and out the front type thing, and keep them separated and isolated that way and remain in their bubbles. And a photo there of Mata Cherington from Awaroa Whānau Services getting her swab done. And Awaroa Whānau Services really led the way for this particular pop-up testing. And I think we did over 100 people. So it was quite a significant part of the community there. And as I said before, not just Māori, we had port staff and also people like from the local forest square that were, interacting quite regularly with other whānau coming through getting tested and vaccinated. Next one we have is down in Murihiku at Waihopai, a Murihiku marae. And I guess a photo there of the staff getting geared up, so learning how to put on PPE properly, doffing and donning, so all that sort of key stuff about staying protected. And this is our team that was there from Awaroa Whānau Services, from the DHB and from well south, getting geared up, ready to receive whānau. And again, another not great day in Invercargill, so we couldn't do a drive-through. It was pouring down with rain and blowing a gale, so people had to come in through the whare, again, in one door, through and out the other, so they stayed isolated and remained in their bubbles. And the last one was another beautiful day down in Ōtākau. I think early May, so we did them all across the space of 2 weeks, and really trying to increase the number of tests being delivered in the Māori community for Māori, and looking at our swabbing rates amongst Māori and also Pacific, and make sure they were as high as they were for other population groups. This one was led by Te Kaika with support of Well South and DHB, and also Ōtākau Marae as well had a big part to play. And this is some of the Ōtākau staff, the Te Kaika staff, at the end of the day. And again, another drive-through, beautiful day down the Kaik, so we were able to set up a tent in the car park, and people remained in their cars and just drove through, received the flu vax first, and then received the test after that. So drove through, remained in their cars, and didn't really interact with anyone other than who was in their vehicles. As I said, another stunning day, and it has its challenges as well. I don't know if you've worn PPE before, but it's like having a plastic sheet on. So spending the whole day in the sun was an absolute mission, and you come out absolutely drenched. And I guess with this one, there was no shelter for staff as well. We had a small tent there, but people were out in the sun for 5 or 6 hours, and at the end of the day, they were absolutely exhausted. So it was a pretty tough day, actually. But again, great for the community. And a whole range of people coming through. Whānau came through, the other community people, and even people in sort of camper vans that were stuck down the Kaik, who've been there through lockdown, came through as well. So it was a great experience. And of course, the kai was all important. So this is our typical sort of kai we put on at Ōtākau, I guess, that Jules that Justine talked about delivers. And it was great for those mainstream staff to come out in the community, be part of the Māori community, and deliver services outside of general practice and the CBACs, which were the other things they were working routinely in. And just look at some data really. This is back in June after that first round. To give you a sense of the numbers, I guess, so in this region in Wales South and the Southland of Otago, we did over 20,000 tests. 1,857 Māori were tested. We had our 4 marae-based clinics, but we had the 3 CBACs and 10 other pop-ups going as well as the 80 general practices doing testing and 19 designated practices. So practices testing people that weren't actually enrolled in that practice. You could just rock up there and receive a test. And I guess we've developed a bit where we've got sort of more up-to-date, streamlined data, where we have daily updates of numbers. And at the moment, we've done over 50,000 tests in the region. And again, try and look across the district about what areas have been well tested, what areas are a bit low, and also by ethnicity to see what our rates for Māori, Pacific and other ethnic groups are like across the region, and what we should do to actually increase some of those. So I guess when we went back into level 2, again, it was thinking about what we could do to increase testing for Māori and for Pacific. We ran some more pop-up. We've done a lot of sessions in Queenstown. A big day up there was over 1,000 tests in a day outside Pack and Save supermarket. Again, a drive-through type thing. We've also done testing in Gore and Balputha and Oamaru as well, trying to target the Māori communities and Pacific communities in those places as well, in partnership with iwi and with Hapu as well. And Runanga, so working with Hokanui and Gore and places like the Māori providers and others in Balputha and Oamaru to try and really engage Pacific and Māori whānau in that testing. The other thing that's really dropped out of this is a whole lot of wellness checks we're doing now. So really trying to re-engage whānau with general practice, recognising they've been in their bubbles during lockdown. And when that sort of that level 4, we exited that, trying to make sure that people re-engage with general practice. They weren't afraid to go to their practice as they needed. So I guess, and we've done that through our Wales South call centre, our COVID call centre, checking with whānau, so bringing all enrolled patients over 50, quick phone call just to check on their wellbeing, check on the wellbeing of their whānau, make sure they're enrolled, and offering vouchers of things to go to their practice if they need to, so to make sure there's no cost barriers and things to them accessing primary care. And that's sort of our health response, I guess. As we go through the different levels, back to level 2, we sort of ramp things up again. And a lot of pressure, I guess, on things like port testing, which is really topical today, and other things that we're still engaged with, as well as the regular testing for people who request it. So that's the health response.
Well, tēnā tātou, that's pretty much it. We just wanted to sort of finish on with this quote from Taiaroa: our elderly are especially vulnerable and we aren't taking any risks, as is the rest of our community. So if I stop the share, it's us.
You're on mute, Rahui.
Am I muted? Sorry. Oh, okay, sorry. So you talked about the ka nui te mihi kia koutou. The absolute work in the regions is fantabulous. It's absolutely an excellent testament to the regions. You talked about the 1835 measles and the flu epidemic. What do you think then, from those kaumātua that mentioned those things in those times, what do you think were the learnings of those particular kaupapa? And now, what do you think are the learnings from a COVID-19 2020 sort of space for our tamariki and our mokopuna?
I think we've learned, like, our whānau are really good at going to their bubbles and staying there. So our whānau went into their homes and they stayed there. Like, I was shopping for 2 lots of parents. It was a huge sort of, so people really went and took it seriously, went into their bubbles, did all the hygiene stuff. Not everyone, but I think on the whole, most people did that really well. So I guess that was one of our key things. We followed the directions, listened to what was going on. Certainly across Ngāi that happened in all our communities that I can see, where people went home, stayed home, and were listening to the daily update stuff, and were following the instructions. That was fantastic. And it seemed to work. Touch wood.
I don't think there was any doubt amongst any of our whānau, hapu iwi and providers that if it hit the community, it wasn't going to have the most, the worst impact upon us. And at our core, it just couldn't happen again. I think all of this time since 1835, I still think we're still trying to recover in terms of land loss, the situation that Māori particularly find ourselves in. And I attended one hui, it was a national one looking at how ICU beds could potentially be a bit more responsive to Māori, because if you look at clinical reasons, most Māori wouldn't get a bed. And so one of the senior doctors here at Otago knew that that couldn't happen. He said his colleagues around the world were heartbroken because initially at the time they made a decision if you were 70 plus, then you didn't get an ICU bed, you'd be triaged to your death. If you had cognitive issues, if you had heart problems, you wouldn't respond to the treatment in the same way, and they knew that that wasn't going to work well for Māori. And so it was kind of heartening to see that people knew that we were going to be the most impacted, as did we. And I can see my mum on the screen next year. But yeah, for me, she's over 70, and so it was really, really important for us that she's actually healthy. She probably would respond better than I did, but it was about keeping them alive, because we've got too much to lose if we didn't, including our culture, our reo, our knowledge, everything.
So I was just talking about if comms play in conversations are ultra important during, the harder times. What are some of the things that we need to entrench, that we need to employ to really tackle the consequences, like we were talking about employment and those kaupapa as well. Our whānau aren't over this yet, and like you said, I think we are still in a frame where we're recovering from 1835 even. So how do we, what would we like to see, what would you particularly like to see going forward from the learnings of COVID in your rohe?
I think that most of the responses should be Māori-led. I think as a community, we not only did what we needed to do for our own, but we extended that to our wider community. So as Peter said, we invited the whole communities because they were part of our bubbles essentially to keep us safe, but we invited and showed that manaaki towards others. I think, I really think the Māori-led is important because we had more to lose, and what's good for Māori is good for everybody else.
Awesome.
I think from the health sort of side, we just need to keep taking services out to the community. We need to get past, bringing people into our hospitals and practices and things, and get things a bit more community-led and a bit more visible and available in our communities. We're a big district of, we're the biggest geographic region in the country, and we need to get services out into our rural areas as well as our main centres.
Yeah, fantastic. And just hitting the road with some of these things was an ultra important kaupapa. We've got a request from Dr. Kahu McClintock, Mum, if you wanted to share any insights from your experiences in the COVID situation.
Mum, that was for you. Oh, you're muted.
I'm unmuted, okay.
Good job.
And we're just having trouble. There's a small dog barking. And everywhere I go, the small dog follows. So I'm locked in the bedroom at the moment to keep her out. I think for me it was, for all the years that is from a young person, growing up at Otago and really spending almost as much time by fishing boat over to Puketeraki or Moiraki, we didn't see ourselves as different. We had lots of, post-World War II particularly, went back to thinking of 1835 and the losses, and then the slow but sure gains that the creation of Ōtākau fisheries by investment of love and a little bit of infrastructure meant that fishermen from there and further south could get back into work. What did happen was that with the loss of greater lands, we ended up with much more displacement. But nonetheless, the hub of every one of those three kaik or kaika remained. They were never fully peopleless, our own and others. And so I have friends that are my age and more who when they came to Puki to swab and give us our flu jabs, automatically assumed that they were part of the Māori community. And so that seeing yourself as a non-Māori, as part of a Māori community, makes the kinds of manaaki that have been referred to in the endless road miles that Peter and his team did, well worth still being alive after 70. At the same time, we had a brother who was diagnosed with aggressive brain cancer at the start of COVID or just before. And two of my sisters and I couldn't get to see him because we were over 70. Now, I can still play in the surf. I can still go fishing. I can do my own garden. I can feed myself. And I did, and Justine and her children and grandchildren and grandchild. And we lived as a bubble, but it wasn't just our household. It was the whole street or the whole block or the whole place. And it was that getting back to community that non-Māori gained insight into and again formed new communities. So it was the grandchildren of the people who had been around during our grandparents' time coming back. And that creation of community and the kind of service that was on offer, the meals were, for some, the only ones they got that were cooked over that time. I can talk about pukeriraki because I know, but Aroha cooked twice a week. And the dessert queen who lives at Waikawati, Myra Tipper, she would meet Aroha halfway from Waikawati to Pukeriraki and hand over the dessert. So Aroha they were 3-course meals every Tuesday and every Friday. Now that was significant in that it created contact. It would be a yoo-hoo from the gate and you went and picked it up, but it was still contact. And for some of those elderly men and women who are my age, shockingly, but much less mobile, had someone who cared about them, enough to feed them, enough to have them swabbed, enough to just pop by and toot the horn. And they would be out the front waiting for the horn to be tooted. All of those things showed what community was and how it is becoming a community once more. And those services were appreciated. They were really appreciated by me, mainly because I knew of the work that Peter and Justine and others had been doing, and your own self, Kahu. So I could tino mahi atu kia koutou. I could go on for hours. Sorry, I talk a lot. But my thanks will always be to the real ngākau of each of those papatipu places where they embraced their entire community for the good of all, not just for those of us with whakapapa to them. It's proper community. Kia ora tātou.
That's awesome. That's an awesome point. If it takes a village to raise a child, then does it then follow it takes a village to overcome a pandemic? And the community spirit that you're talking about is absolutely fantastic. And it's pretty much intrinsically known to our whānau. We weren't just a nuclear family. There was cousins, uncles, aunties all around, and the whole community banded together. And that's absolutely fantastic. So if that's one of the things that we should take forward is the rejuvenation of the community spirit. So tēnā koe whaia. It's absolutely fantastic to hear and your sharing. And you can never get bored listening to the real life experiences of our kaumātua through some of these trying periods. Nō reira, tēnei te mihi atu kia koe. Just to come back to Justine and Peter, how was we've heard messages from around the country about the collaborative effort with civil defence and DHBs, and how was that working in with whānau hapuru and iwi? And I do take your point that going forward, there should be, the responses could be stronger in Māori-led activities and projects.
Yeah, Puketaraki talked a lot about that. So they had to have literally daily meetings as part of disaster response. One of the things I noticed at the DHB, so before we went into lockdown, you could kind of see how serious it was going to be. And I'm on the iwi governance at the DHB, and I rang our chair and said, can you just get in touch with the DHB and ask if they'd have a prepared response? Have they thought about it? And one of the things I noted was that all staff, including Māori specific positions, got redirected into kind of a general response from the DHB, which for us left a really big hole because there was going to be no Māori response. And so that's something that we got together really quickly. I think that the Rūnaka had the added pressure of doing that general response, so being part of those daily report-ins around that emergency procedure, as well as trying to cater for those communities. So I think that's something that needs to be considered and looked at, is how is it that we can have those Māori, if it's Māori-led, then maybe some of those resources won't be as general and we can still have less risk, I think.
Some of these experiences, was there any sort of funny little anecdotes or things that were that would be of interest to, 'cause we've heard a whole host of different things, like the TikToks from Kaumātua and their mokopuna together, and just that building of resurgence, I suppose, of the community and the family wairua. Was there any little funny anecdotes or humorous little tales that you might want to share?
I can't think of any anecdotes, but I mean, what it did do is brought everyone quite closely together. So we're quite siloed in house. Everyone came together quite well, DHB, PHO and others, Māori providers. There's lots of wee things happen on the marae about people getting their flu vaccinations for the first time ever, things like that, and how sort of scared of that they were, and how, after the event, how it was so easy to actually receive. So there's lots of that sort of stuff. People are really fearful of getting swabbed. You see on TV of people coming through and, shying away from the swab type things. There's a lot of that sort of noise out there as well. And back when we were doing these marae drive-throughs, we're doing, it was the 3 swabs. It was both nostrils and your throat. And that's recently changed to just being one swab up one side of your nose, so which is a lot easier to accept, to be honest. But I remember, I remember Mataputa coming through. He'd never had a flu vaccination before, really hesitant about being swabbed. And, it was great to sort of get those first-time whānau through who had never had a flu vax, really hesitant about being swabbed, but would come through, I guess, for the good of the community and receive that sort of stuff. So that was fantastic.
Yeah, I watched, so his mum said, Hu Pōtiki, my uncle, her youngest brother, was diagnosed with the aggressive brain tumour. And so as a whānau, it was really, really important that because they couldn't get there physically, that they were able to remain connected to him every single day. And so I had the fun of watching all my elders work out how to have group FaceTime conversations. And it was definitely entertaining at times. I think if my daughter was here this morning, she'd probably roll her eyes a lot more and didn't find it as amusing at times. And that continued right up till now. So we only actually buried my uncle last week, which is why we're doing the presentation this week, kia ora koutou. And so my uncle, who's actually younger than Mum and her sisters, still really struggled. And so he was stuck in self-isolation, managed isolation in Auckland. And they were trying to go between iPhones and different types of phones. And he didn't have a Facebook account, so trying to explain to them what Messenger was and how it works on multiple platforms and trying to get him to download it. And I kept saying to my cousin, oh, he's done really well. I ended up setting up a Zoom. Mum said, set him up a Zoom, but it took her 3 hours behind the scenes to teach him how to download the Zoom, how to go on the Zoom and do all of the things. So I suspect there's an entire older generation who are experts now on, you know, you would think they're digital natives. So yeah, it was a little bit amusing watching it at times.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Can I
Of
say
course you
something?
can, Whai.
Okay. Well, at the time, just prior to lockdown, we had been running a Māori librarian's hui out at Pokitaraki. And so I was taking my niece back. It was closed early because of the 48 hours notice we got prior to lockdown. So I took her to the airport, and on my way back, I popped in to see Justine and Takiwai and the Moko Moko. Anyway, long story short, by the end of that day, my niece had arrived back home on Waiheke, and they'd been trying to trace her. She had been sitting beside a COVID diagnosed active person in the plane. So Justine and the other two generations in her household came to mind. So we were 4 generations for the first time, not, but for something that serious. Well, for the first 3 days, Justine's mokopuna showed me how to wash my hands properly. And this was a very, very serious thing. And so we would spend quite some time in the bathroom, and he'd say, now, tēnā taua, you have to do this first and you have to do that second. And what for me was an automatic thing suddenly became quite a significant thing, because a 4-year-old was teaching a 70-something-year-old how to properly wash her hands in order not to get COVID-19. And that for me was one of the greatest highlights, that a 4th generation moko could teach a taua how to behave herself and wash her hands properly. He also gave me lessons on how to wipe my bottom appropriately as well. But, you know, those kind of things were real treasures. That child doesn't have any locked doors, you know. So if you do go to the toilet at my house and you fail to shut the door, he'll visit you there. He's not shy in that sense. But it shows how well they've been taught at school too. He'd only just started school when we were closed down. So in that short week, he had learned how to thoroughly wash his hands, and he could wash them for at least an hour if you would let him. But it was his tender teaching of me in a really funny way that I found was one of the highlights, if there had to be one, of the whole of that lockdown. Kia ora.
It's an absolutely beautiful story, you know, the whānau dynamic, and I can just see a teacher in the making, and or a hygienist in the making. And so are there, in your view then, even, you know, so like Fire reminded us, and you've reminded us, we've been through measles epidemics and pandemics, flu, we've been through world wars, we've been through depressions and recessions, and we haven't gone anywhere. We haven't faded into the night, as it were. So what, in your view then, are some of the opportunities so, you know, it's only in the darkest times that you see the smallest glimmers of light. And so what are some of those glimmers of light, or what are some of those opportunities that you may think has come off the back of this kaupapa? It's not all doom and gloom, eh?
No, I think our opportunity, especially here, because in addition to COVID, one of the things that did was that we were able to get some access to the DHB Māori data. So sitting in a governance position, and if you asked me what Māori health looks like, I can anecdotally tell you what I know. In addition to that, we're obviously starting a hospital rebuild here. And I don't know if I would say lucky enough, but I did the cultural impact assessment for that rebuild. And in the end, we decided, because it's a 2nd generation site in terms of the planning and the consent process, we decided to take a health view on that. And so one of the opportunities we've got from that was because I went to whānau and asked basically, you know, what the impacts would be of having the new hospital, is that we are now in a position to work with the DHB and hopefully Treasury to get a hospital that responds to the needs of Māori. We've been asked to create a Māori model of care, and the DHB is so focused that the hospital will be ready in 10 years that they're not ready to create one. So I think we're using it as an opportunity to kind of try and strike and see if we can turn the tables in our favour for the first time in terms of health delivery. So yeah, the cultural impact assessment I handed in finally yesterday, and the next job is to work with whānau from Waimaru to the bluff and decide what our model of care is going to be, and that will underpin what the DHB does, as opposed to a mainstream model of care that fails us miserably and some tikanga best practice. And I think a lot of that has come about because of the pandemic. Yeah, so that's kind of, I think, if we can make it work, that's going to be quite exciting for us.
I think for me the big thing was about that sense of whānau and community. Like we've come together again as whānau, as community, and we don't sort of want to lose that. So I mean, during lockdown, you met neighbours you've probably never seen before. You know, they're out walking down the road or walking the dog or whatever it was. They sort of came together. Even though you're in your bubbles, you know, they're across the other side of the street, you could say hello. You met people you hadn't met before in your own wee sort of, in your wee kāinga. So that was pretty cool. So I don't want to lose that sense of community that we maybe had lost a bit.
That's really cool. So, you know, some of the stuff that you know, in governance and things like that, did you find that some of the things pre-COVID weren't, people just weren't accepting or ready to embrace some of these whakaaro, and yet once they saw the wonderful mahi that you did in your rohe, and the responses that you stood up, and the whānau stood up, and the community stood up, it just gave a whole boost of confidence that absolutely we can do some of this stuff, eh?
I think so. And that they were patting themselves on the back, and we can let them do that. That's fine. If they thought it was their idea and their great work, good on them if it gets what we need. Yeah.
That's a key point too. And so, you know, absolutely fantastic to hear your story, and absolutely look forward to reading the comprehensive chapters in the book, because it actually takes into account all of the responses across the motu, and fantastic that our whānau in Puketeraki, our whānau in Ōtākou, are happy to share some of those stories that will be, you know, how we're talking about the 1835 measles. Well, we're in 2020 now. What will our tamariki be talking about in the year, I don't know, 2050? They'll be using some of the things that we have done in this generation. And I particularly want to acknowledge Whaio, our taua, because one of the hardest things during lockdown was the adaptation to the tangihanga processes. And I wanted to acknowledge you, Whaia, for the loss of a family member. Must have been absolutely difficult in those times. I mean, it's awesome having the Zoom or the FaceTime, but actually not being able to run the normal processes of tangihanga must have been a hard pill to swallow. Fine.
I think so. It was the waiting. So we knew he was diagnosed, and we couldn't go over and be there and help him through that. Only one brother could, because he was in Queensland. And then when he died, we grieved, but it wasn't real until the package was unloaded from the plane last Tuesday week. And this time last week, we were bringing him home in the absolutely truest sense, 5 months or 8 months after the first call and 5 months after his death. And so we were able to properly grieve. The undertakers in both Australia and New Zealand had taken great care so that we could have an open casket, not a closed one, but an open one. And though he wasn't quite as handsome as, you know, as he was perhaps the day he died, he was still very much able to be viewed. He was still very much able to be spoken to at night, or told off, or praised, or all of those things. And I think all of the things that we were able to do couldn't have been done years ago. And it, I guess in a way, it sent me back to when I was a young thing and went to Vietnam to sing in a band. The numbers of people whose sons and daughters died there and were never able to get back home, and how hard that grieving could be, was we've done that. I mean, we're still a bit sooky, but way, way better than we were so few days after his death, because you couldn't touch it, you couldn't kiss it goodbye, you couldn't, you know, put your hand to the face, you couldn't go and tell him off. None of those things were available, and it's a long time to wait and hold your tangi, you know. But now if we burst into tears, no one cares, because they've seen him, or they can see. I'm just across the road, I'm a fence away, and I can see where his grave is. And that's as close as we could get for months, but not touch. Now we know we've put him in there, and they've made his bed beautiful. He's got lovely flowers, and so we gave some to Mum and some to Dad and some to the other brothers, but we know where he is now. And it's kua, really, as it was said so many times at the tangi when people were speaking, kua ea.
Kia ora ki a koe whaia e pikau nei I te mate o tō whānau, tēnei te mihi aroha. And just a huge thank you to the three of you that have willingly shared some of the kōrero that had happened throughout the taratahi or the Rahui lockdown. Not this Rahui, the other Rahui, but it's absolutely fantastic to hear and to share some of these discussions. And Dr. Justine Kemp and Te Tuakana Peter Ellison and our taua, ka nui nei te mihi atu ki a koutou. Kaore I a rika rika ngā mihi ki a koutou. I pikau I ngā mahi nui, I āwhina I ngā hapori, I puta ki te whaiau ki te ao marama, o tirā ka haere tonu ki roto I te whaiau I te ao marama. No reira, koutou e ngaku rangatira, koutou kua whakahui mai nei, aha koa kai runga I te waia I tēnei wā, hei te wāpea ka tū taki a kanohi ki te kanohi, he no mō tēnei wā, ko ia tēnei te mihi ake, ko ia tēnei te mihi ake, ko ia tēnei te aroha ake. Ka nui nei te mihi atu ki a koutou, tēnā koutou. And just to reiterate, whānau, that the contributions from our wonderful expertise here on our webinar and the previous webinars are all going to be collated into the puka puka, ko Tōku Ara Rā, Aotearoa COVID-19, and that's a collation of experiences during the Rahui and the Taratahi lockdown from across the country, from some of our best and brightest around the country, who have stood up, who have worked within the communities, who have worked with whānau, hapu and iwi, who have worked in collaboration with government agencies, with other community groups as well, to stand up the strongest response, because Te Rau Ora is all about sharing some of those experiences as a pathfinder, should we ever get into some of these difficulties again. And I just wanted to finish really on the note, mā te kōrero ka mārama, mana ka mata. And with discussion, we get to a bit of an understanding, and understanding then turns to wisdom, and it turns to our 4-year-olds teaching our tupuna to wash their hands, to exercise the highest levels of not only hygiene, but in that tikanga and wairua of the family. And so that's absolutely fantastic. Look, whānau, ko ia tēnei te mihi ake. I understand that the puka puka, ko Tōku Ara Rā, Aotearoa COVID-19, will be out sometime next week. So please stay tuned to Te Rau Ora, and they'll finalise some of those details in the coming days. Nō reira, e ngā kurangatira, Justine, Peter, taua, tēnei te mihi ake rā ki a koutou. O tira ake a tātou katoa kua tū hono maira. Ka whakautia atu I runga I te karakia, whakamānu kaupapa. E pīrā hoki rā I te āhuatanga o tō tātou puka puka e puta nei I roto I ngā rangi e tūtata mai nei. Nō reira, ko ia tēnei. Tēnei te wi, tēnei te puna tau rōri e hurana I te whare o uanuku. Ka herea ki reira te ihi te mana te tapu ko teiki keirunga. Ka whanatu au ki te pū, ki te wānanga, ki te tauira take mai ai. Ko ia ko te tongi kura, ko te ākina te mea nui. Tēnei te ni, tēnei te nānā, tēnei te hana te tupu. A whitia hapainga ko rangi nui e tū nei, ko papatua nuku e takoto nei. ko te ira tangata e ora tonu nei. Whāno, whanake, hara mai te toki, haumi e, hui e, tāu. E te
Kia ora
iwi,
rā.
e te whānau, pai marire kia tātou katoa.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.